the rule of law, and we're trying to make sure here that the rule of law is observed and respected. And finally, we're talking about individual liberty, the freedom I talked about at the outset of the remarks, that we need to make sure that if we allow individual liberties to be abridged in this country, that it is done pursuant to legal authority, is done pursuant to warrants. This is done pursuant to the government going to a court and providing just reasonable cause to assume that there is some reason to surveil an individual American citizen. That's what this dispute is all about. That's what this issue is on both sides. And it's interesting, as I listened to the president not too long ago, when he was once again trying to use fear tactics, scare tactics, to intimidate this body into doing what he wants to do, into protecting him, into essentially engaging in, helping him engage in a cover-up of the activities of the administration and the phone companies. He made the statement, said, right now, terrorists are plotting activities against the United States that would make 9/11 pale in comparison. That's what he said. And when I heard him say that, my thought was, well, wait a minute. If he actually knows that they're plotting something that's worse than 9/11, then I guess he's getting all the information he needs. Somehow, some way, he's hearing information. If he can make a claim that with that specificity, it's going to be worse than 9/11, they're planning it now, then maybe he's listening to something. Maybe the intelligence authority that he was using works, and he doesn't need this additional authority. But I don't think that's the case, of course. I think basically what he was trying to say is, do this or you die, because that's been the strategy of this administration in many cases. Do what we want or you will be in trouble. You will be harmed. Your family will be harmed. I don't think the American people are buying it anymore. I think they've cried wolf far too often. But that's what we've been dealing with in trying to have a very reasonable approach to providing the type of authority that we agree is necessary to allow us to wage this struggle against terrorist activity. So that's sort of, in an introductory way, what we're dealing with. And it gives me great pleasure now to welcome another member of the class of 2006, my good friend, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Dr. Kagen.
Thank you, Congressman Yarmuth. I really appreciate your words of wisdom and your counsel, and I'd like to engage you in some conversation on this evening. Earlier this evening, we heard our colleagues on the Republican side raise some interesting issues, and one of the questions that someone raised was, almost facetiously, I hope, where's Waldo? If international security depends upon finding anybody, it's not Waldo. We took our eye off the ball. Where's Osama bin Laden? And what are we doing about him and his violent extremists and the people that follow his way of thinking? So may I ask you a question? Congressman Yarmuth, is it really true that our intelligence community went dark? Are we no longer listening in on conversations? Is some of this fear-mongering actually real? Is there any truth in there at all? Are we going dark? Are we not listening to people who want to do us harm?
Well, I think the answer to anyone who thinks about it is obvious. No, of course we're listening. And what's more, we're listening pursuant to authority that exists in the law. And when the current law expired recently, the authority to surveil under the prior act did not expire. And in fact, there have been numerous people who've said, we have all the authority we need to protect this country.
But sir, there have been telephone calls going out, there have been radio conversations, there have been television commercials in districts around America trying to indicate that, in fact, we've gone dark, that we suddenly stopped listening. Are you telling me here tonight that that just isn't true?
You know, you don't have to take my word for it. Experts in the field have testified to the fact that this is not the case. Richard Clark, who's the former chief NSC counterterrorism advisor under both Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, said, "Let me be clear. Our ability to track and monitor terrorists overseas would not cease should the Protect America Act expire. If this were true, the President would not threaten to terminate any temporary extension with his veto pen. All surveillance currently occurring would continue even after legislative provisions lapsed because authorizations under the Act are in effect up to a full year."
So,
So, of course, there is no reason to believe the ads and the scare tactics that have been perpetrated against members in the Congress.
well, then the question has to be asked, what's really going on here? What is it that our Republican colleagues disagree with us about with regard to protecting not only America using FISA, but also protecting our constitutional rights? Can we not protect America and our Constitution at the same time?
Well, obviously we can. And obviously this body did last fall. We passed a very, very reasonable reauthorization of the Protect America Act, which did virtually everything that the president wanted. And it provided authority to surveil under reasonable circumstances. It didn't grant the NSC or any other institution the ability to go on a fishing expedition. It retains some oversight, some court control. Again, this is a secret court, but this is the way the law was set up in 1978. It's worked very well since then. There are some tweaks that are needed in this law. We recognize that. We did what the administration requested. All of a sudden, this issue of immunity comes up. And again, I can't believe that this has anything to do with worrying about whether AT&T pays out millions of dollars. This is not what they're concerned about. I don't think the gentleman believes that either.
Well, I appreciate what you just said, but it raises another question. When you indicate that there's a question of immunity, is that not another word for amnesty? Is it correct to say that the current president, President Bush, is seeking amnesty? And if we're going to give amnesty to someone, isn't it a natural thing to ask, well, what are we forgiving somebody for? Don't you think we should understand exactly what someone did before we forgive them and give them amnesty? Isn't that a reasonable thing to ask?
I think it's not only reasonable, I think it's our duty to require that, because it would be a frivolous act if we just said, well, whatever you did, whether it was legal or not, then we're going to grant you immunity or amnesty for doing that. No, we have to know in order to grant immunity whether or not there's a reason to grant immunity. Why would we want to do that if there were no reason to do it?
Well, isn't that also one of the reasons why we were sent here to Washington to try and fix this situation, where the 109th Congress failed to ask questions, failed to ask, and the pertinent question, failed to hold hearings to find out what it is we're fighting for, why we really invaded Iraq, where's our money being spent? I mean, I've been told that 20% of the money we've spent in Iraq is simply unaccounted for. 20% of over $1 trillion is a lot of billions of dollars. So I think the 110th Congress has a duty, a responsibility, and yes, a constitutional responsibility to balance the balance of power, to reset the balance, and to also investigate wherever possible and ask questions. So the questions I would pose to my Republican friends is, what is it you're afraid of? What is it that someone has done wrong? And who is it we're trying to protect? Are we trying to protect America, or are we trying to protect special interests in either the telephone industry or the people that ask them to break the law in the White House? Do you think it's possible that what they're really concerned about is their own immunity in the White House? Is that a possibility?
Well, I think that's exactly the case. And I don't blame the telephone companies. I mean, I think they were in a very difficult spot. When your government asks you to do something and says that the security of this country is at stake, then I suspect that most corporations would comply with the government's request. Now, these corporations, being the major corporations that they are, with lots of money, with lots of legal advice,